Welcome to the Bible Savvy Podcast, a weekly conversation about how to understand, enjoy, and apply God's Word. It's time to jump into a new passage from the Bible Savvy reading plan. Hey everybody, I am here with Pastor Courtney and Pastor David. David, what is our question this week?
Yeah, this week we're going to the library, guys. What book have you read that you would love to reread and have just as much satisfaction rereading it? And so that could be fiction, nonfiction, if you want one of both. You're not allowed to say the Bible. All right, okay?
That's
all right,
good.
guys.
That's good. Okay.
Let's be clear.
Okay, so I have a bunch, and I don't know how to
I'm
narrow
shocked.
it down. Oh, yeah. So let me put it in some categories. There are two books that I have reread more than any other. One is the book Perelandra by C.S. Lewis. It is a science fiction book, but it is spiritually and theologically rich. So I've read that probably 15, 20 times. And Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Those two books are probably... I'll be going back to them for the rest of my life. In general, I'm always reading C.S. Lewis. I probably read 2 or 3 of his books a year and just keep going round and round and keep reading them. On the fiction side of things, I read to my kids certain things as they get to the right ages for them. So we have read Harry Potter, Narnia, the Wingfeather series multiple times. We're currently going through that with Silas, reading it to him as the youngest kid. And then for me, this is super nerdy, but there is an author named Brandon Sanderson, and I have read his books, which are these big honkin' bizarro fantasy books, just over and over again. And every time he releases a new one, I feel like I got to reread all the rest. So yeah, his books are a lot.
We shouldn't have let him go first.
No, I'm sorry.
Why did we let him go first? I said books and he was just...
There we go. I mean,
Here's 18.
I trimmed it down. I didn't include G.K. Chesterton or any of the rest. So
You really only need 1 or 2,
So
max.
much,
Courtney,
so much.
if you...
I can't. Well, because originally the question, as it was worded, was which one would you read again and again? Not really the idea of like the way you just worded it was that you would like almost like it would be anew and fresh every time I read it. Are you looking for like, I mean, I feel like that's different. Like there's I'll read it over and over again because the familiarity. And then there's the like, oh, wow, if that could still be a surprise.
yeah, well, no, it doesn't have to be a surprise.
If
Just
there's
something
something
you
you
would
could
go
be
back
a
to.
surprise.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, so I don't read a lot of books over, quite honestly. I generally read a book once, make my decision, and then I don't read it again. But I do read Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership by Ruth Haley Barton once a
That's
year.
a good book.
Yeah.
So ironically, we're in Exodus. We're talking about Moses. And
Yeah.
so I was like, oh, of course, that would be the
Nice.
book.
Bonus points.
Yeah, so there you go. So that would be one that I read just once a year. I always feel like it's good for me. It gives me a pause in my year. And actually, I would be about ready to start it soon here. It's a new year. It's time. So that would definitely be that. As far as other books, like again, any C.S. Lewis, Narnia books, like there are quite a few. There are C.S. Lewis books that I've read multiple times because
it's C.S.
they're
Lewis.
always good. They are always good.
Yeah.
There's something about that. So that's where I would go. I mean, of course, as a parent, I've read a lot of books over.
The kid book that you're like, I have this
And
memorized
over.
now.
I know.
Again. I could quote
I'm
some
not
of
even
them
looking at the
if you'd
words.
like
I'm
me
just turning
to.
the pages. Yeah.
David, what's your
Yeah.
book, man?
Okay, so mine on the more serious side would be a book by Henry Nouwen called In the Name of Jesus.
Oh, so good.
Real short book, but it's just packed with something different. Every time I read it, I feel like this is so good. So I've read it many times, and I always look forward to rereading it again. And I always feel really smart because you can read it in like 30 minutes. it's not a long book.
It is not long.
Okay.
So I love that, In the Name of Jesus. On the fun side, my kids are 5 and 6. You mentioned reading to the kids. But there's one book that I actually do enjoy reading to them because the reaction is so strong. But it's a new book called The Book with No Pictures. Have you heard this?
Yes.
There's literally no pictures. It's just words, but it's like a trick to get mom and dad to say funny words and say things.
Yes.
And the reaction of my kids every time is like, it's like their first time hearing it. It gives me so much joy rereading it. And I know they would offer that book to me as the book I should be saying in this podcast. So
That's what it is.
A little shout out to my kiddos.
That's fantastic. Well, before we turn to our passage today, I want to remind you we are on a brand new YouTube channel, which means we need you to like this video, subscribe to the channel. That's really going to help us as we get this established. One thing you can do that might be fun for you is to actually go back to the video we've recently released, which is an interview with Carmen Imes. Carmen Imes is a scholar of the Old Testament, and we interviewed her about the book of Exodus, and we are actually doing a giveaway. Okay, so she provided a few copies of her books, Bearing God's Name and Being God's Image. They are fantastic, truly fantastic. You want to have these, but if you go and watch that interview, leave a comment on the video, we will enter you into a drawing to get these books. So that would be a great way for you to support the podcast and walk away with some good stuff.
I think I'm disqualified from winning.
I was
right?
just about to ask, can I do that?
Yeah, you'll have to find another way to
Carmen,
get
I'll
the
have
send us
all
more
my fake
books.
accounts.
It's really good.
In
It's
there.
really good. So we are going to be in Exodus chapter 19 today. This is a really pivotal chapter in the book. This is where the people of Israel, having come out of slavery, been rescued, walked across the desert, finally arrive at the mountain, and they are going to meet with God. And I mentioned Carmen's books here, but this book, the subtitle is Why Sinai Still Matters. If you want to understand what's going on in this scene and the sections where the people of Israel are at Sinai, this book is probably your best go-to on that. If you're confused by these things, she does a great way of framing that, so I'd recommend that. But here's the key thing to understand at this moment. God, right now, is making a covenant with the people of Israel. So a covenant is this. It's the idea of someone who is not family becoming family through a promise. So it's a promise that turns non-family into family. And so what God is doing is saying, I am going to be your God. You are going to be my people. We are going to be united in the same way that a husband and wife are united by covenant, or an adopted child is united with their family by covenant. You are going to be a part of my family. I'm going to take care of you. You're going to be my people. I'm going to be your God. That's what's going on here. And if you don't keep that in mind, some of this stuff can get a little random, a little confusing, not knowing what's going on. But they're about to meet with God for the first time here. So we're going to read Exodus chapter 19.
On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the 3rd day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, 'Be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain." After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, "Prepare yourselves for the 3rd day. Abstain from sexual relations." On the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered in smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." The Lord replied, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them.
All right. The next step in comma is observations. So we're going to take a look at what we see here.
My first observation is the very first verse. It says the first day of the third month. So right when I read that, I started to think, okay, if I'm the Israelites out in the desert, it's been 60 days-ish. You know, I think the shine on this honeymoon has maybe worn off a bit. This newfound freedom, this new life and excitement of, oh my gosh, the Red Sea and all this, thrill. And I'm thinking 60 days, traveling with livestock and grumpy, people sleeping in the dirt. I'm sure that there is conflict, that there's a little bit of frustration. We know in the chapters right before this, there was the battle with the Amalekites, is sort of famous one of Moses keeping his arms over the people. So they've had to endure conflict. There's also been need for resolution in disputes. So Moses has had to step in as a judge and delegate. So I'm just trying to think and put myself in the position of these people who had this amazing moment with the Lord that's been released, but now they're like living independently, like living fully in freedom. And I imagine that they're a little bit desperate for, okay, but what next? Like what's coming if I've been sitting out here in 60 days? Lord, are you still there? And you mentioned this is the first time that people are going to meet with God. I bet they're biting at the bit a little bit. I imagine they would be biting at the bit to.
Yeah, you can even extend that longer. Like there's the immediate time frame of saying, okay, what's next? But there's also the fact that they have been slaves for a long time, generations. Mm-hmm. And so they only know one way of life. And they have now been set free, which is super exciting. And yet you're in this in-between time of like, so who are we going to be? How are we going to live? What's life going to look like for us? Like, it's one thing to say, you know what? I had a job and I have a new job and I'm going to the new job, and all of a sudden you're learning the new job. But if you leave a job and don't know what the next job is, weird, funky things happen in that in-between time when you're like, what is the thing going to be? They're like that. We had a job, we had a way of life. We didn't like it, but we knew it. Mm-hmm. And now what's it going to be? And in some ways, that's what they're at the mountain to learn. Mm-hmm.
Well, and right away then in verse 3, God says, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel." Identity words right away. He's just identifying, this is who you are. You are the descendants of Jacob and the people of Israel. And so for a people who have been enslaved and have maybe wondered who they are a little bit, he defines it right away. It's right there. Here's the identity words. I also, just right after that, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings, like just that beautiful protection. What does that look like? And brought you to myself, this just drawing in of God's presence. What a, beautiful way to kind of start in comfort and, tell people who.
That picture of eagle's wings, all I can think of is in Tolkien, the eagles carrying the hobbits. Sorry. If you're going to make it a running podcast, I'll make it a Tolkien podcast.
That's great.
All I can think is Bette Midler.
One of the things that's worth noting here is just what you highlighted, that God has rescued them. And this is really important. Dr. Imes pointed this out in her interview when talking about the Exodus. We think of when we get to the mountain and God starts giving the law, our default assumption, which is wrong, is to think the law is God telling the people, here's what you need to do to be saved. If you do all the things, you'll be okay with me. But the truth is they've already been saved, right? They were slaves. They were ransomed by the blood of a lamb and walked from death into life, from slavery into freedom. That's already happened. It wasn't like God said, hey, here are the rules. If you follow them well enough, I might get you out of here. They've been sprung, right? They're out. But the this here is saying, now that you're out, now that you're free, now that you're saved, let me describe to you the life you're going to be living. And so it is important to see that. You've seen what I did. I brought you out on eagle's wings, right? Like you could say to one of us, right? Like, you've seen what I've done. I went to the cross for you. I died for you. I gave you new life. Now let me describe the life you're going to be living. And that's really important, because we get confused when we default to that first assumption.
Yeah.
Right. And then in verse 5 after that, he says, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. And there's this like, if you just trust me, if you trust in my goodness, if you trust in that I want good for you, then things are going to be really great.
Yeah.
It reminded me, we've mentioned on the podcast before, but every other month we do staff theology on a Tuesday morning, and we've been reading this book, Union with Christ, and the author says at one point in the chapter we read recently that every temptation is rooted in this question of, is God really good? Like, is God's goodness actually a thing? Does God really want the best for me? It's because every temptation says, God doesn't really want my good, so I'm going to chase after something else. And I feel like when God says this, he's like, if you just obey me and keep this covenant, you're going to be my treasured possession. Things are going to be great. And so there's a question beneath this of like, do you trust that I'm good? And the question is, will the Israelites respond?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I circled that because it is an if-then statement. Like, this is an if-then kind of a covenant. It feels like if you, which is different. I feel like the other covenants have not been if-thens. If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you'll be my treasured possession. And there's more to that, but I think just the if-then is an interesting statement.
Well, especially when you want to say, look, they've already been rescued, right? Like what I just described. You say, well, is this a condition? Is this like, we got to earn our way to being God's people? A way that really helps to understand this is to think of it like a wedding ceremony. So they are at the mountain. They're at the altar. They're going to make vows to God. And really between chapter 19 and chapter, I think about 24, is this whole scene where God is laying out, here are essentially the vows, right? So when you read the laws, don't read, here's just the moral rules that I want you to follow. Think, I, Clayton, take you, Michelle. Yeah. I promise to, right? It's those things that you say, right? For better or for worse, this is what we're going to do. So this is in some ways the officiant of the wedding saying, if you will promise, if you will be a faithful wife or husband or whatever, if you will do this, then you will be married, right? Like so this is less of a, well, we'll see about this. Will you earn being treasured possession? Because they clearly are a treasured possession. It is more saying, if you want to have this special relationship, this partnership where you have a unique role in my plan, then this is the agreement you've got to make. Will you do these things? Will you so-and-so take so-and-so to be your, right? That's what's going on here. And so the if-then it takes a different cast when you think about it that way.
Yeah. The covenant is more than just this like legal agreement.
Exactly.
I think that's where people lose that. Our view is like a contract, not a covenant. This is a covenant. This is, there's some pieces around that. I think there's also in verse 6 where he says, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The idea that priests can come before God.
Yeah.
And he's saying you will be
that's right.
a kingdom of people who can come before me.
Yeah.
That's huge.
I noticed with that language, it was interesting to me because I've seen it before. And I've obviously read this before, but like I've seen it in other places that I've read more often in the New Testament. So in 1 Peter chapter 2 is one of my favorite passages. It actually is talking to a group of Christ followers and saying, you are a special possession of God. You are a kingdom of priests. You are a holy nation. And it's talking to followers of Jesus. It's using the same language here and saying to this little church, this group of Christians, like, this is you guys, right? You have this relationship with God. So this comes up again and again in the Bible. What else you guys see?
All right, I've got a repeated word for my next observation, and that's consecrated. So we've got verse 10, verse 14, and verse 22. They use this word consecrated. And consecration in general feels like a big religious Bible word that we don't really use in contemporary language. So I figured we should talk about this.
Yeah.
Because there seems to be a physical component, but there also is clearly a spiritual component. So I don't know. What do you guys What do you guys think? Or what do you see in this whole consecrated language?
You want me to start, or are you going to go, Clayton?
Why don't
No,
you go? It doesn't always have to be a hey, Clayton. I'll let you go first.
Hey, Courtney, what do you think about consecration?
What do you think about consecration? What I think is interesting in this is I put burning bush moment, same place, bigger show.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Because with the burning bush, he said, take off your shoes. Like there's something to be made clean here. And that was a very small consecration, right? This is obviously a big, like, get yourself ready. Like, God is coming. Well, yeah, same place, bigger show.
Yeah.
There's more.
I really like that connection. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Because that taking off the shoes is a small way of saying, I'm going to be clean. This is holy. I think we have a hard time with the consecration, cleanliness, all this stuff in the Old Testament, because culturally we have very few things where we use those categories. We don't talk about clean, unclean, holy, sacred, profane. Like we just kind of have a leveled world where most things are, you can wear whatever you want to whatever restaurant. There are very few places where you say, oh, I feel like I can't do this in this place. There are some things that we feel like, you know what? Well, to go back to the wedding analogy, like there are certain things you wouldn't do in your wedding dress. There are certain things you wouldn't do at a funeral. There are certain things you wouldn't do at a ceremony that was honoring, a veteran or something, right? There are things that you say, there are moments where it just doesn't make sense to do certain things that you would be able to do someplace else, right? So when we talk about consecrating, it's not saying, here are some things that God doesn't like, so make sure he doesn't see you doing them. What they are is saying, at certain times and places, it's appropriate to do certain things and not appropriate to do other things. It's decorum. Like if you went to meet the president, you would, there would be certain ways you could interact. You'd wait to be spoken to. You'd stand when certain people came in the room. You'd shake hands only when certain people, you know what I mean? Like you'd do those sorts of things. This is like that. You're meeting God. So there's a little decorum. You're going to get cleaned up. And in the ancient world, they had, everybody had this notion of there are certain bodily functions that leave you unpresentable in holy space. And the problem wasn't that you had those basic functions. The problem was if you brought the evidence of those things into the sacred space, right? You don't go to a wedding in your workout clothes. You leave those behind, not because working out's bad. So things like, get clean, right? Don't have sex, okay? Some people look at that and be like, does God have a problem with this, right? Is this well, no, he invented it, right?
Yep.
But it's a way of saying, no, there's a certain appropriateness coming into God's presence that you're going to abstain from certain things in order to be prepared in an appropriate way for this very special moment. And so I think that's what's going on. We just don't have that sense in our culture as much.
Yep.
Yeah. I made note of all of the times that it talks about kind of the boundaries around the mountain. It's kind of a look, don't touch, that the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people, but put limits around the mountain and tell them, don't approach the mountain, don't touch the foot of it. Whoever touches it will be put to death. I mean, there's big consequences. Like they can't come near the mountain. Look, don't touch. I don't know if that may be a little bit of a hey Clayton in and of itself. But yeah, just creating that space around it. And that is said multiple times. Make sure they don't force their way through to see the Lord so that they perish. Like God cares about it.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
A really helpful way to get an idea about this is to watch the Bible Project video on holiness. It's really tremendous. It's probably the best explanation I've seen on this concept. But the way to think about it is the presence of God is like a star, right? You want the sun in your solar system because without it, you die. But if you were going to approach the sun, you better have the right kind of spaceship, right? You better have, you know what I mean? Like you can't just interact with the sun and expect to live. That's what's going on here. If God's going to be present, you must approach appropriately. Or like nuclear power, you're going to wear certain things when you go into a nuclear power plant. That's just safety. The nuclear power is awesome. It can do powerful things, but it could also kill you, right? And so that's what's going on here. I think the most interesting part about it is that God is saying, I'm coming to you, right? Like it's this tension of don't approach or you'll die, but I am showing up literally right there. You know what I mean? There is this weird tension of does God want to be close or want to keep us apart? And it is the tension to be resolved in a lot of the Pentateuch here. As we're reading it, that question of how can people approach God is kind of the big question. It's what's going on here.
Yeah. All right. I've read the Bible on observation, but I've seen twice in 15 and 16 says, prepare yourselves for the third day. And on the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with thick cloud over the mountain. And immediately my mind is going, oh my gosh, wait a second. I know about another famous third day.
Yeah.
Not the band.
Not the band.
Not the band. Where's Brendan when you need him? But yeah, the third day, the resurrection of just this appearing of Jesus back from the grave, it just feels like an obvious allusion to what's coming in the New Testament, which I thought was and a really powerful appearing on the third day of like thunder and lightning and the stone rolling away and the God appearing on the mountain. Like, oh gosh, I got a little bit of chills just reading it.
There is there's a question in New Testament scholarship where there's a part where Jesus says, "Don't you know that the scriptures say that the Son of Man must suffer and on the third day rise from the dead?" Well, it's really easy to find the passages that say the Son of Man must suffer in the Old Testament. And there are other passages that allude to him being alive after that. But the idea that he must rise on the third day, it's really difficult to find a passage that says that. But when scholars go back and look, the best sense they can make out of it is the fact that there are lots of passages like this one where over the course of the Old Testament, important things happen on the third day. And when you start to pay attention to that, then you start to see that. It's almost like a very subtle theme that doesn't truly get made sense out of until there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because there's no one prediction that's like, on the third day, the Messiah is going to come back. It's like, well, no. But the third day was when a lot of important things happened in the Old Testament.
You know, I just highlighted in verse 20 where it talks about the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up. And the Lord said to him, and they have this conversation. And I just wrote that Moses knew God. Like he is able to come up to the mountain and, come a little closer. And I don't know that he would have been, he had familiarity. But, it says everyone in the camp trembled. I mean, this is like a fearsome sight. And Moses speaks and the voice of God answers him. Like they have a familiar relationship. He is familiar with God. He knows God. And even earlier in, verse 9, where it talks about, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you, that they would trust him because of the relationship they have.
I'm struck by the description here of the presence of God, a thick cloud, verse 16, thunder, lightning, thick cloud over the mountain, the loud trumpet blast. There is this, it continues to talk about the smoke billowing, like the smoke from a furnace, the mountain trembled violently. It's, we live in the era of modern worship music that emphasizes closeness and intimacy with God and the things you're talking about, right? It is harder for us to get that sense of God is the sort of God that should you encounter him, you might die, right? And I think it's worth like dwelling a minute in the idea of like the fear of the Lord feels like a strange concept to us. Like I shouldn't be afraid of him, but if you actually were in this moment, which is a good moment, it's God coming to meet with the people. The reality is, it would be incredibly scary. It would be something that would intimidate you, that you would take incredibly seriously. And when you see your leader saying, you're going to go walk up into this cloud with the mountain shaking like that, you would wonder how it would work, right? Like you would say, this is a truly remarkable thing. Of all of the things we've seen so far, we saw a sea get parted. We saw all sorts of, things happen in Egypt. This is the wildest one, a human being walking into that cloud where God's presence is. How's this going to go? You know what I mean? That's a scary and strange thing and remarkable. All right, let's talk about one of the M's in common. Let's talk about message here. If you guys were going to summarize a principle from this passage, how would you do it?
I went with pretty similar to what you were just talking about. My message is God is both familiar and force. And just that idea that God, there is a familiarity that we are a kingdom of priests, that we can come before God, but that not to forget that God is a force and that there is the fear of the Lord is a real thing. And so it was that idea of like God is both familiar and he's also a force.
All right, so my message kind of goes around the theme of consecration. I was just thinking about the people who had to prepare themselves physically to hear from the Lord for the first time, I sort of think like they're in that moment. I mean, there's a little bit of anticipation. There's a little bit of like, what's going to happen? Like what is he going to say? What are we going to hear? What's going to be different? So the message I took away is that the word of the Lord is more clearly received by ears that are ready.
All right, my message comes from that first section in the passage where God is describing, like, this is who you are to me. You're my special possession. You're a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And so I said this, being God's special people brings special access and calls for special responsibility. So it's wonderful to be God's people, but here's what that means. You're going to have access to God. Also very cool, sort of scary. But also that means it's going to require a kind of responsibility before God that is distinct because you get the special access. So being God's special people brings special access and calls for special responsibility. Let's turn to the other M and comma. Let's do meditation. And I'm going to read to you those verses right at the beginning here that describe who God's people are. It says, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. I'll give you 45 seconds to prayerfully ponder that. All right, let's turn to the A and comma application. What do you do in light of all of this?
Who started?
Yeah.
Did I actually? Oh, man. Okay. Well, my message was God is both familiar and force. And so my application, as I really thought about this, has to do with the way we worship and the way that I think oftentimes we worship with almost too much familiarity. There's something really beautiful. I actually, when I did go to church as a young child, I went to a very high church, pews, pipe organ. The pipe organ was the Skinner Memorial Pipe Organ. It has a name. There was an awe and a reverence to that space that I still can reflect on and to think of. And I think sometimes we walk into really familiar spaces like our auditorium here, and we think this just feels very familiar. And I think there is a part of me that needs to sometimes step back and really soak in what the force part of God is. What does that mean to consecrate myself? What does that mean to, if that was before me, a mountain with thunder and a billowy cloud and fire, do I know that God? And do I worship that God? Where sometimes I just sit and in silence and worship and awe, in reverence to a God who has that much power and force. And do I act that way in my life? Do I see him as, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a God who has this much power? And so do I respond to God in that way? But also to know that God is familiar, that he carried you on eagle's wings, that there's a protection, brings us to himself. We have this access. We can come before God. And there is a certain reverence to that I think is worthy of reflecting on as people who follow Jesus and who follow this God of the Old Testament, as well as our very familiar, best friend Jesus in the New Testament.
Yeah, Lion and the Lamb.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good. My message was the word of the Lord is more clearly received by ears that are ready. So going with the consecration theme a little bit here. So my application was take a moment to prepare myself before the next church service. So, so I do, I bathe daily, so I don't have any concerns there. I'm talking about spiritually preparing myself. I think about most of the time when I'm going into a church service, usually, I'm greeting people at the doors, or I'm connecting with people I haven't seen in a minute, or I'm checking off, checking with volunteers or something. So a lot of times I'm just slipping in and then just jumping in mid-chorus or mid-verse. And it's almost a little bit of the familiarity piece. Like it's almost like this is just business as usual. It's just the next thing in the list. And I thought, man, what if I went in with a different mentality of I need to pause, even if I'm, running from a conversation to another, and I need to pause and even just like open my hands, take a moment to receive, to say, hey, this next couple of moments, this next hour or whatever is maybe a little bit different of a space spiritually than I was just in, and I need to actually be prepared for the word that the Lord wants to speak to me, right? Like he might not be giving me the 10 Commandments next, but he probably has something he wants to teach me, and if I'm not aware of the holiness of this moment, if I don't prepare myself spiritually for this time, I might miss it. And so my simple application was just to slow down and pause and take, whether that's 10 seconds, a minute, whatever it is, to just really just consecrate the moment of, hey, this is set apart, this is holy. Lord, what do you want to tell me?
Yeah. So my message is being God's special people brings special access and calls for special responsibility. And I think the application is to ponder that special responsibility. And the metaphor that I want to go back to is the idea of wedding vows. There is something right about when you're like reflecting on your marriage, you say, look, this is what I'm thankful for, that I get to have access to Michelle, that we have this special relationship, that like we have this life together. But there's also something really appropriate to saying, let me take very seriously the promises I made. Like what does it mean to be committed to her? And what have I said? Here's what I'm going to do for you. And some of those are very weighty things. And it's not less romantic, right? Like sometimes we think, well, if I think about the rules that God has for me and the expectations he has for me, that's like colder somehow, or that's somehow like less intimate with God. But I don't know. We wouldn't say that with our marriages. We wouldn't say, okay, you know what? Sticking with my wife in sickness and in health is somehow unromantic. Like it is hard. Right? If there are times of sickness, if your spouse gets, ill or it extends for a long period of time, but my wife had surgery earlier this year, and it was like, look, we're going to help out, right? Like I'm going to do things that I wouldn't normally do. I'm going to take care of you in ways I wouldn't normally take care of you. And that is like not necessarily like, oh, this is the lovey-dovey stuff, but actually that's where the like real relationship is, right? It's in keeping those hard vows and doing those hard responsibilities to say, this is what the relationship is about. I think the same thing is true when we talk about things with God. We say, let me think about what it means to actually be loyal to my God and to be faithful to all the things that he commands and to love him through my obedience. That's not less intimate. It might actually be more.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Join us again next Monday for a new episode where we'll be looking at another passage from the Bible Savvy reading schedule. And in the meantime, if you're not following along with the reading plan, check out BibleSavvy.com. Also, you can subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Email us your questions or suggestions at podcast@BibleSavvy.com. Lastly, tell your friends, and we'll talk to you next week.